Donald Trump just made the most aggressive financial demand in the history of North American bilateral relations. He stood in front of the cameras, completely ignored decades of alliance architecture, and demanded $2.8 trillion from Canada. He called it a bill for decades of military protection. He called it a penalty for unfair trade. He issued an ultimatum. He tried to corner a sovereign nation. He thought he could break them. But Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't blink. Carney didn't scream. He didn't fire off a late-night post. He simply reached for the one lever Washington desperately hoped he would forget about. And now the consequences are spreading, from the stock market to your local gas pump and straight into the Pentagon. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what changed. I'm going to show you who panicked first, and I'm going to explain why this $2.8 trillion threat may go down in history as the single biggest miscalculation of Trump's entire political life. If this analysis is the kind of real-time geopolitical intelligence you need, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because this trade war is escalating faster than anyone predicted, and you're going to want the next update before the mainstream headlines even catch up. Drop your location in the comments so I know where my audience is watching from. And if this breakdown is useful to you, like it and share it with someone who needs to understand what's actually at stake. Here is exactly what happened. Late this week, President Trump stepped up to a podium and dropped a bomb on the global economy. He demanded that Canada pay the United States $2.8 trillion. His argument was pure grievance economics. He claimed that Canada has been freeloading on American military defense under NORAD and NATO for 70 years. He claimed that Canada's trade surplus is, in his framing, theft from the American worker. He said, and I quote, "They owe us and they are going to pay or we cut them off completely." He thought it was the ultimate power play. He thought he was dealing with a weaker neighbor that would rush to Washington, bend the knee, and beg to keep the border open. Trump viewed Canada as a vassal state, a 51st state that just needed to be brought to heel. But Trump isn't dealing with a career politician who scares easily. He is dealing with Mark Carney. Carney is a former central banker, a man who spent a decade at Goldman Sachs, a man who guided the Canadian economy through the 2008 financial crash, and was then actively recruited to guide the United Kingdom through the absolute chaos of Brexit. Carney understands markets better than almost anyone currently in public office. He understands leverage, and more importantly, he understands exactly where America's hidden pressure points are. Sources indicate the White House expected Ottawa to panic. They expected a frantic phone call from the Prime Minister's office asking for a discount on the demand. Instead, Washington got dial tone, and then they got a masterclass in economic counter-leverage. Carney called a press conference in Ottawa. He walked out, looked directly into the cameras, and appeared completely unbothered. He didn't offer a single dollar. He didn't even validate the $2.8 trillion figure by repeating it. Instead, he announced an emergency national security review of Canada's critical energy and mineral export infrastructure. He didn't threaten. He stated a fact. He reminded the world that a trade relationship runs in both directions. Within minutes of those words leaving his mouth, global financial markets recognized what Donald Trump had entirely missed. If you want to understand why Washington is suddenly scrambling behind closed doors, you have to look at the data. Let me walk you through the actual numbers and the structural realities you are not being told on the evening news. The first data point is what I'd call the heavy crude chokehold. Trump loves to tell his base that the United States drills its own oil and doesn't need anyone else. That claim is a structural myth. The United States relies heavily on Canada simply to keep the lights on and the cars running. Canada currently supplies over 60% of all U.S. crude oil imports. Every single day, approximately 4 million barrels of heavy Canadian crude flow south through the Keystone Pipeline and the Enbridge Mainline, feeding massive refineries in the American Midwest and along the Gulf Coast. Here is the critical engineering detail Trump's advisors apparently failed to communicate to him. Those American refineries are custom-built to process heavy, sour Canadian crude. You cannot simply substitute it. If Trump cuts off Canada or if Carney throttles the pipelines, those refineries cannot flip a switch and start processing light, sweet crude from Texas. The chemistry and the mechanics do not allow for it. If Canadian oil stops flowing, those Midwest refineries shut down completely. When Carney casually mentioned a review of energy export infrastructure, oil traders in New York instantly understood the implication. The price of crude oil spiked. Midwest refineries began issuing emergency warnings to their investors. If Canada slows the flow by even 15%, gas prices in battleground states, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, will rise by $1 a gallon within days. That is not an abstraction. That is a direct political consequence with midterm election arithmetic attached to it. The second structural vulnerability is what I call the critical minerals trap. Trump demanded $2.8 trillion ostensibly to fund the U.S. military. The irony is that the U.S. military literally cannot build its weapons systems without Canadian inputs. On uranium, the United States leads the world in nuclear energy generation, but America holds only about 1% of global uranium supply. Canada holds 10 times the reserves, and Canadian uranium is 100 times more concentrated than the global average. Canada supplies approximately 25% of the feedstock that powers American nuclear plants. On nickel, nickel is a foundational defense material. It is required to build jet engines for American fighter aircraft and to produce the armor plating on U.S. Navy warships. The United States has only one active nickel mine, located in northern Michigan. But here is the structural punchline. The United States does not have a single completed nickel refinery. Every ounce of nickel extracted from that Michigan mine is shipped across the border to Sudbury, Canada, to be refined, and then American defense contractors have to buy it back. If Carney imposes an export quota on critical minerals, the American defense supply chain grinds to a halt. The third pressure point is the power grid. This is not just about oil and metal. It is about the electricity running through the walls of American homes. Canada provides approximately 85% of the electricity the United States imports. If you live in New York, Minnesota, or New England, your home, your hospitals, and your schools are largely powered by hydroelectricity flowing down from dams in Quebec and Ontario. Trump demanded a ransom, but Carney controls the switches that physically power the American Northeast. If Canada imposes national security export quotas on electricity, something Carney's government is reportedly drafting right now, rolling blackouts in major U.S. cities become a mathematical certainty, not a political talking point. The fourth data point is the auto industry exposure. Look at what the trading floors showed the morning after Trump's demand. U.S. auto manufacturers panicked. General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis rely on a deeply integrated, effectively borderless supply chain. A single car component may cross the U.S.-Canada border 6 or 7 times before a vehicle is finished. You put a wall up, you demand $1 trillion ransom, and that Detroit assembly line freezes overnight. Wall Street analysts immediately downgraded U.S. auto stocks. Investors dumped shares. The spreadsheets tell the story clearly. The United States bought roughly $400 billion in Canadian goods last year. Slapping massive tariffs or demanding impossible ransoms doesn't punish Canada. It taxes the American consumer and destroys American jobs. The data confirms one structural truth. Trump brought a megaphone to a leverage contest, and Canada is holding the leverage. This is precisely why Trump is losing control of the narrative, and more dangerously for him, losing control of his own party. His entire political brand is built on dominance. His operating theory is that if he shouts loudly enough and threatens a large enough number, the other side will eventually fold. It is a 1980s real estate negotiation tactic. Bully the contractor, threaten to walk away, and wait for them to drop their price. But you cannot bully a sovereign nation that holds the structural keys to your own economy. You cannot evict a country. Trump is now trapped by his own tactics. He escalated with a demand, $2.8 trillion, that Canada physically could not and would not ever pay. He backed himself into a corner with his own posturing. If he walks it back, he looks weak to his base. If he pushes forward, he triggers an energy crisis and a supply chain disruption that will crush the U.S. economy right before the midterm elections. That is the definition of a political feedback loop with no clean exit. Watch the cause and effect sequence playing out in real time. Trump threatened the $2.8 trillion bill. Immediately, Canadian energy companies paused their cross-border investments. U.S. supply chains got nervous. Logistics companies and trucking firms began hoarding inventory. The cost of commercial freight skyrocketed. And who absorbs that cost? The American consumer. The cost gets passed directly to the shelf at the local grocery store. Reports indicate that behind closed doors in the Oval Office, Trump's own economic advisors are quietly urging him to withdraw the $2.8 trillion demand. They are pulling up the data. They are showing him the Midwest refinery dependency. They are showing him the nearly $9 billion in aluminum imports that American aerospace companies rely on. They understand that America is the structurally vulnerable party in this specific equation. Trump is fundamentally reactive. He operates on instinct, cable news, and political anger. But the world has adapted to that operating style. Global markets are now pricing in the reality that the United States is no longer a stable, rational, or predictable trading partner. Investors systematically price out unpredictability, and Trump is manufacturing it by the hour. He demanded obedience from Canada, but Canada chose alternatives. Now, look at how Carney is executing his counter strategy. The contrast is analytically striking. He doesn't fight the way Trump fights. He doesn't manufacture noise on social media. He uses systems, institutional alliances, and cold market realities. Carney's entire career has been about engineering stability out of chaos. When he was governor of the Bank of Canada, he saw the 2008 crash coming before almost anyone else in public policy. He cut interest rates aggressively, insulating the Canadian banking system while American banks collapsed. He executed the same playbook in London, holding the British economy together after the Brexit vote sent markets into freefall. He knows how to handle populist leaders who govern by impulsive threat. He doesn't take the bait. He converts their pressure into his leverage. While Trump was demanding money on television, Carney was working the phones. Sources indicate he has been accelerating trade discussions with the European Union, the United Kingdom, and the Indo-Pacific region, sending a clear and strategically calibrated message to Washington. Canada has other buyers. The data supports this posture. The U.S. share of Canadian goods exports has already fallen to roughly 71%, the lowest share since the early 1980s. Canada is already structurally decoupling from U.S. market dependency. With the newly expanded Trans Mountain Pipeline operating at full capacity, Canada can now bypass the United States entirely, loading heavy crude onto tankers on the Pacific coast and shipping them directly to Asia. Carney isn't just protecting Canadian sovereignty in a news cycle. He is fundamentally rewriting the power dynamic of the North American continent. He is also executing what central bankers call forward guidance. He tells the market exactly what he is going to do, and then he does it. It builds institutional credibility that no political bluster can replicate. When Carney speaks at Davos, the world's most powerful institutional investors and sovereign wealth funds take notes. When Trump speaks at a podium, they brace for impact and begin hedging their positions. Carney's long game is building a coalition of allies exhausted by Washington's coercive trade tactics. He is demonstrating to the rest of the world that you don't have to surrender to economic extortion. You don't have to write a check because a president yells at you. You have to know where your structural leverage is and be willing to use it. Carney has also just released Canada's new defense industrial strategy, a massive pivot in national resource allocation. For decades, Canada simply purchased American military equipment. Now Carney is retooling the Canadian economy to design and build its own defense technology domestically. He is deliberately severing Canada's reliance on the Pentagon because he understood a confrontation like this one was coming. He prepared the battlefield before the opening shot was fired. So what does this mean for you, the American or Canadian citizen watching this unfold? Even if you don't follow geopolitics closely, Canada touches your daily life at every point. If this standoff continues, it will hit your wallet with measurable force. Gas prices at the pump, home heating costs this winter, grocery prices, because everything you buy is transported on trucks that run on diesel, and that diesel originates from crude oil extracted in Alberta. If Trump sustains the $2.8 trillion demand and Carney retaliates by throttling energy exports, the American consumer absorbs the entire economic shock. You will effectively pay the ransom Trump is demanding, just in the form of inflation. But zoom out for the broader structural picture. What is actually at stake here is far larger than a bilateral trade dispute. For a century, the United States served as the indispensable nation, the anchor of global trading stability, the one power you could count on to maintain predictable rules-based economic order. Trump's demand, the extortion of a neighboring ally for trillions of dollars, signals the effective end of that era. It shatters global institutional trust in a way that cannot be quietly repaired in a diplomatic communique. If Washington will do this to its closest neighbor, its largest trading partner, its most reliable military ally, the rational calculation for every other nation is simple. What guarantee do they have? Alliances are structurally fraying. The global economic map is being redrawn in real time. Carney didn't raise his voice. He raised the cost of ignoring Canada. And the image of a calm, analytically rigorous prime minister standing firm while the American president escalates with bluster, that image is being studied right now by governments from Berlin to Tokyo. Canada is effectively writing the operational manual for how to resist Trump-era coercive diplomacy, and the rest of the world is downloading it. Now, here are the three scenarios I assess are currently in play, and how each one impacts you. The most probable outcome, which I'd call the quiet retreat. The U.S. stock market begins sustained deterioration. Gas prices creep up 20 cents, then 50 cents. Auto industry lobbyists storm Capitol Hill. Trump's major donors, whose portfolios are bleeding, force him to pivot. To protect the political narrative, Trump claims a massive, invisible victory. He asserts that Canada made undisclosed concessions. He quietly drops the $2.8 trillion demand, and the border relationship normalizes. But the reputational damage to American credibility is permanent and priced into every future negotiation. The world will have watched Trump fold. The second scenario is full escalation. Trump's ego prevents him from stepping back. He imposes 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods and closes the border to commercial traffic. Carney immediately invokes national security authority and cuts the oil pipelines. Midwest refineries run dry within 72 hours. Auto assembly plants in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana shut down. The U.S. enters a localized economic depression. The dollar deteriorates. The northern border becomes an active economic war zone with no clean diplomatic off-ramp. The third scenario, and arguably the most structurally dangerous for American long-term power, is what I'd call the unexpected reversal. Canada accelerates its pivot to Asia and Europe so rapidly that the United States permanently loses privileged access to Canadian critical minerals, the exact materials required for advanced technology, electric vehicles, and next-generation defense systems. The Pentagon briefs the president that without Canadian nickel and uranium, U.S. national security is critically compromised at the supply chain level. Washington is then forced to publicly retract the demand in what becomes a globally visible display of strategic overreach with no face-saving mechanism available. Whatever plays out over the next several weeks, the structural uncertainty is significant and entirely self-inflicted by Washington's political design. Donald Trump tried to treat Canada like a distressed Atlantic City casino, something he could bankrupt, bully into submission, and acquire for pennies on the dollar. Mark Carney just demonstrated that Canada owns the bank. The $2.8 trillion demand was designed as a show of ultimate American strength. Instead, it exposed America's deepest economic vulnerabilities to the entire world. It showed every rival government exactly where American economic armor is thinnest. Now, I want to hear your analytical read on this. Do you assess that Mark Carney is executing a masterclass in sovereignty protection, writing the operational playbook on how to neutralize coercive diplomacy? Or is he deliberately provoking Trump into overreaction with the intention of exposing the structural fragility of the North American economic relationship on a global stage? Drop your take in the comments below. Tell me who you think blinks first, and tell me where you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button right now because this is moving faster than the mainstream press can keep up with, and you're going to want the next analysis before the next headline drops. Like this video and share it with someone who needs a clear, data-grounded read on what's actually happening. Stay sharp, and I'll see you in the next one.